There was one line that I actually pulled out in typical like didactic professor fashion. As I was, occupational hazard, you know how it is. One line from that I always like to put on the board for my intro to gender, women's, and sexuality studies students. And once I got to do it on Valentine's Day, so I thought you would appreciate it. It's a line from Shulamith Firestone in The Dialectic of Sex, the chapter on the culture of romance, where she says, "Romanticism is a cultural tool of male power to keep women from knowing their conditions." And I was like, happy Valentine's Day.
Gosh. I don't even remember that line. Oh my gosh. That's the thing. Thank you for telling me that. And I have to revisit that book. There's another book, Sex and the City, which may come up in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That book, so the show is utter garbage, even though I obviously enjoyed it when I was a teenager when the first one came out.
No, the clothes are great. The show is terrible.
But the show is terrible. Like looking at it with clear eyes from, the vantage of middle age. But when I read the book, nothing to do with the show. Some of the characters, so there's like 4 main characters on the show. Mm-hmm. That's not in the book. I don't even think that one of the characters doesn't even exist. The Samantha character doesn't even exist. So anyways, the point that I'm making is that the book is actually a chronicle of the development of fuckboyism amongst boomers. It is so good.
Oh man, I loved your reading. I have to say, I was just like chef's kiss. The Carrie as Jewish like makes that was a brilliant reading of the show. I was like, that 100% snaps this into focus.
Thank you for that.
And you went right for the curly. I was like, you can see this from my own hair. Maybe that struck a nerve. But it's perfection. It was perfection. I was like, this also grants this show significant depth that it didn't actually earn, honestly. but that's the beauty of doing that kind of work. So yeah, I loved it.
That and Friends, Friends is, leaving the kind of legacy I'm quite sure it did not want to leave. It just wanted to be this light, fun show about these singles in New York and how they find love. It's like this show is about what white privilege is like when you are middle class or wealthy and don't really have to worry too much about making money. It's like none of this. Very few of the characters on that show take their jobs seriously. What they're serious about is like, can I lose weight? Can I get a partner? And it's just like, okay.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am really delighted to introduce our guest, Dr. Sabrina Strings. She is professor and North Hall Chair of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, won the 2020 Body and Embodiment Best Publication Award, and was an honorable mention in the 2020 Sociology of Sex and Gender Distinguished Book Award, both given by the American Sociological Association. Her new book, which is largely what we're going to be talking about today, is The End of Love, Racism, Sexism, and the Death of Romance. Sabrina, welcome. Thank you for joining us on Ordinary Unhappiness.
I'm so happy to be here.
So let's get into it. I think a significant number of our listeners are going to know you, whether from reading your previous book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, or from listening to Kate Mann, who was on our podcast, talk about you and your work and how formative it was for her. And while the new book, The End of Love, is a very different project in some ways, the two books do share, a host of preoccupations. So I'm hoping you can tell us a bit about the origins of The End of Love and also about the ways in which this latest book continues some of the crucial ideas and methods of Fearing the Black Body. There's just so much here, so we can go wherever, we can take in whatever direction you want. The distinctive ways that you're reading visual images from, as Patrick was saying, within the canon often. How you attend to the legacies of texts that taxonomize ideas about beauty and race, so much more.
Yeah, Both of my books are deeply personal. And my first book, people may not notice it as much because I'm not actually talking about myself in the same way. But whenever you hear any interviews with me describing my experience of writing The Fearing Black Body, I always invoke my grandmother because she was the ancestor who was most important to me even discovering this particular area of inquiry because it was her research question. She was like, why are white women on diets? Like, what's going on with that? You know, so, the book was really a way of honoring her and honoring the ancestors. This book is personal in a different way. It was about my own experience in dating. So effectively, the book came out of me having a conversation with some friends. And so we were like in graduate school, but just about to finish. So we were thrilled. Anybody who's ever been to graduate school knows that feeling. So we were in Napa, just like in a hot tub, enjoying a little bit of wine. And I was explaining to some of my friends, like the latest dating disaster. And normally I would tell people these horrible tales as a way of getting a laugh and then moving on. But this time, when I was telling one of these stories, one of my friends said, "Are you okay?" And that put me in a very different place than I had been previously whenever I was talking about romance. Usually, as women, we feel like we have to be trying to have these romantic relationships. You're a failure if you're not in a couple, and other forms of queerphobia. So I sort of like, wait, what if I just stopped going on these endless bad dates and started to chronicle what my experience has been? And that was the genesis of the book. Interestingly enough, when I went to take this material to a publisher, the editors and my agent were sort of like, you really need to try to figure out how we got here, especially as Black women. And so there's a way in which my own personal experience is often the jumping off point to a variety of different forms of inquiry that might begin somewhat autobiographical, as in the case of this first book, but then take me to a place as I'm trying to do a genealogy, try to figure out, okay, but like, how did I get here? And more importantly, how did Black women and other women who I call insufficiently white wind up with these terrible dating profiles?
I just wanted to register for anyone who's listening to both My Theory and the Black Body and this one, because I think something about the way you do, well genealogy, right? That these sort of like, tracking the like filiations and inheritances and reconfigurations of these concepts across time, it shakes so much loose and it produces so much insight, I think, for the reader. And the first book was sort of like a dazzling kind of from so many different vectors, from the race science to the history of the transatlantic slave trade to thinking about aesthetics and so much more. This, I think, the personal stuff that you weave into it also shakes other things loose too. And I think it certainly did for me as a reader. I made me thinking about interactions I've had or interactions my friends have had. I have to imagine that you've already encountered and doubtless will encounter more people who will just see themselves in these moments where historical notions of desirability or of what or of like how attachment or partnering or courtship should proceed or how they sort of misfire. But anyways, all these types of antagonisms and repermutations of these tropes, these different inventories of how to classify people or sort them. It's just so well done in the book. And I really wanted to commend you on that.
Oh, thank you so much for that. When I decided to think about how to approach this as an historical study, which by the way, I didn't want to do. When my agent was like, this should be historical, I was like, no. Because it just felt like a tremendous lift, whereas I wanted just to explain what it's like to be a Black woman dating and not just have a one-off story on TikTok, because there are quite a few of those. But then she said, no, people need to understand that this is not just about you. They need to understand the richness of this. And so then I thought, oh, okay, well, how do I approach this as an historical study? I wanted it to be expansive, but I also wanted it to be creative. And so that's why I employ what I call a renegade methodology.
Yeah.
And it's indebted to feminist methodologies. The very idea that we don't just pull random things from the Enlightenment that white men have created and then reproduce it, right? No. What we actually do is think critically about our ends, and then we use that to guide the type of investigation that we are doing. So I said, okay, I want to know how I got here. And I also know, as a media studies scholar, that the media plays a tremendous role in the way we see the universe. So I'm going to look at the media, specifically going to look at men's media productions to see how men are understanding themselves in relationship to women. If we look at women's magazines, we can see all of these stories where women are trying to figure out how to present ourselves to make ourselves more desirable to straight white guys. But if you look at men's magazines, it's quite obvious they're not doing that. So what they were doing in men's magazines, I found out pretty quickly early on in my investigation, was that in the middle of the 20th century, coinciding with the second wave of the feminist movement, there were so many high-profile men, most of them white guys in entertainment, who were saying, do not have romantic relationships with these gross feminist harpies or these tough ball-busting career women. You don't want any of that. You want a pliant, docile woman who's good looking, right? So just being able to find that pretty early on led to some of my other investigations. Like, okay, well, what's the background of Hugh Hefner? And what's Hugh Hefner's relationship to Black men? And so that early finding sort of was the vector that shot out in multiple different directions to help me figure out how they ended up saying those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I feel like ties the two books together also, this is a podcast about psychoanalysis, so we talk a lot about desirability, right? The conditions of the possibility of desirability. But you're talking about beauty in both of these. And I kept thinking, I think Patrick before off mic brought up Tressie McMillan Cottom, but I love that essay In the Name of Beauty, where she talks about how beauty is, and this, I actually did pull this quote. You gave me an excuse to revisit this essay. Beauty isn't actually what you look like. Beauty is the preferences that reproduce the existing social order. And the way that, like these books together as a kind of 1-2 punch really unsettle so many prevailing ideas about the idea of beauty as this thing that just sort of inheres in the world, and that beauty is something that could possibly be decoupled from ideas of whiteness and Blackness. And beauty also this is less in the new book and more in the earlier book, but beauty in relationship to size and shape and what that has to do with, the ways that we not imagine, but experience what can be desired and what can be desirable. And that Patrick talking about things shaking loose, that's something that I feel like when you read these two books together, just like precipitates out, is all the way that all these things that people think of as their own individual preferences, like that's just what I like. That's just what I'm into. That's just what I think is hot. Like, just the ways in which people tend to think of those as individual and idiosyncratic, and how they are just so absolutely not.
And then there's this gross comedian who has a special on Netflix, and I'm sure I could look his name up, but probably I shouldn't, but maybe I will. But the point is, there is this guy who had a special that came out maybe in 2023, in which he's just like, well, when people ask me what my preferences are, I say that I like tall, skinny women with long hair and big tits. Like, what's wrong with that? It's like, okay, no one is telling you that you don't have the right to desire that. We're only explaining that you don't desire that. That desire was forced into your little body by white male supremacy. Now, you are a white man, and so you do think that this is somehow natural and normal because all the other white guys want that, right? High five. But this has been going on for hundreds of years. And part of what I talk about in my book is the way in which this is deeply homoerotic. What does it mean for so many men? Yeah, right? There are so many men who are like, okay, I only want to have sex with the kind of woman that other older white guys told me are acceptable. Okay, let's do that. That is so peculiar to me. And think about the difference between men and women on that score. Sure, women do have biases as it pertains to the kinds of men that they're looking for. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but we find it far more common that a woman will overlook various aspects of a man's identity that don't meet the golden standard or whatever that might be because of some genuine affection for them. That's less common with the men. So there's just this really curious way in which men don't recognize the way in which their homosociality is homoerotic by nature.
Yeah.
So and just sort of getting back to your question or your statement about Tressie, I think she's phenomenal. I mean, she gets so much recognition already, but still, I feel like people are recognizing her for her charisma and her incredible speaking skills. And they probably don't spend as much time as they ought to revisiting some of the things that she's written, because that is absolutely spot on.
Mm-hmm.
When you look up the definition of romantic love, it usually begins with a sexual attraction. So already right there, there's an element of objectification coded in the definition of romance, because there are only certain types of women in our society that are going to be deemed sexually attractive enough for a man to take notice and then therefore to pursue them. So it's not in any way as if we are free to form our own desires and pursue them. We are expected to desire certain things. And if we don't, we are ridiculed. And if we do, then sometimes we're going to find that we may not be able to meet those desires. Our system is very much hemmed in, and we don't see it in that way, which is one of the reasons why it flourishes.
I really want us to dig into one of the ideas that structures the book, in which we've been alluding to, but I want to get it on the table for our listeners, which is the romantic ideal. And I will confess that I kept thinking about meta narratives and like the Jean-Francois Lyotard famous line about postmodernism as incredulity towards meta narratives. And what I really want to pluck from that is just the idea of meta narratives themselves, because so much of your work, I think, does involve identifying them, dismantling them, and debunking them. So you take on the construction of race as, this seemingly quote unquote natural entity, or in The End of Love, what you call the romantic ideal. And another way of putting this is that you're taking, I guess I want to call them ideological formations that have so thoroughly calcified into what feels like reality, what feels like the texture of our reality: race, romance, beauty standards, et cetera, that it comes as kind of a shock when you realize how wholly contingent they are. And it's the romantic ideal in The End of Love that takes center stage as a genuinely harmful meta-narrative that requires our attention and ultimately, I think, for you, our disbelief. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you mean by this idea of the romantic ideal, the ways that you're working with it, and also, I would suggest, the ways that you're working against it?
Yeah. So I'll begin with what the romantic ideal is, and then I'll step back and start explaining where it came from.
Perfect.
So the idea of romance is that a man who is courageous is going to prove his valor and his dedication to a woman who he finds beautiful by going out and doing something gallant, or perhaps he's going to rescue her, right? So the romantic ideal relies on a man being courageous and tough and brazen, pursuing a woman who is attractive and docile and polite and significantly high status, right? So this is how we get the idea that men are supposed to be active and women are passive, right? These things, we think that they are natural, and they are not. They are encoded within the romantic ideal. And it comes from the medieval France, as it turns out. So what we believe is the very first romantic narrative that was ever written was co-authored by Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and Chrétien de Troyes, who she was writing with. He was a poet. And they created Lancelot, the Knight and the Cart. Now, we've all heard of Lancelot. And just as a quick aside, I was doing like a little bit of like a presentation for my students on Sir Mix-a-Lot, Baby Got Back, because that also contains like a lot of the things we're talking about today. And I was like, oh my gosh, Sir Mix-a-Lot is a variation of Lancelot. Like, this is how deeply encoded. Yes, right? Whenever you see the a lot, whenever you see the Sir and a lot, that is a direct reference to Lancelot. So
you're blowing my mind right now.
Right?
Yes.
And I appreciate that you like it. My students were not as impressed, but anyways.
They're younger than I am. They don't have all the words to Baby Got Back memorized from their childhood.
Right, exactly. Exactly. If you grew up at a particular time, you understand the significance of Baby Got Back. So in any event, what Lancelot did is that he was one of the Knights of the Round Table, which was fictitious. There's no evidence that any of these people actually existed. And the Knights of the Round Table were there to serve King Arthur. At a certain point, an evil king captures Queen Guinevere, who is married to King Arthur. And Lancelot, who is in love with her secretly, volunteers to rescue her. And so the entire story is like his travails trying to make his way to Guinevere and get her away from this evil King Melanjon. Now, what's interesting about all of that, besides the fact that it's, a completely a fiction, is that this romantic tale is about infidelity. Because obviously, Guinevere is already married to King Arthur. And in fact, the first romantic tale is a tale of love and loss. Not just that tale, but for 600 years, the vast majority of the romantic tales, in fact, the only romantic tales that I've seen during that time period were about love and loss. They were not about marriage and commitment, because the idea was that marriage is about duty. It's about family legacy and landed wealth. It's not about affection and intimacy and passion. You have to get that outside of marriage. It was only in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, that there were a variety of men who were starting to argue, you know what? We should, in fact, embrace liberty, as it pertains to forming relationships. We should embrace romance. It's a form of love. And this is a better way of going about creating these pairings than these families orchestrating relationships. Now, there are a whole host of problems with this, not the least of which is that, according to Stephanie Kuntz, this was actually a veiled backlash to the feminism that was going on by women in France who were saying, hey, aren't we in a revolution? Hey, we demand equality too. So there's this way in which romance is being propped up as an anti-feminist enterprise at the very time in which it's being connected to marriage.
Another thing that is, again, I wanted to just underscore is the way in which your vision of media it's capacious, and it really gives, media is mediation, in the sense like it's this sort of template or this matrix of ideological dispositions and narrative associations that encompasses everything from the troubadours to Sir Mix-a-Lot, right? And that it's all sort of in the given, and it naturalizes certain dispositions and attitudes, but it is just thoroughly contingent. And I think thinking about the contingency of that, again, I'm going back to just to the existence of a figure like a Hugh Hefner, right? Or like a Leslie Wexner or something, right, behind Victoria's Secrets, where it's like, these are actually these very specific, frankly, very creepy, to say the very least, like men, like, like the explicit Jeffrey Epstein connections in the Western case. People Google that one if they want. But like deciding that this is what a desirable body is, this is like the setting, right? You're going to be on the white horse. You're going to be in front of the castle. It's a full gestalt. And it teaches you how to desire, but it really is, it's somebody else's desire, but it's also somebody else's desire for you to consume a product that they're selling. Like there's a whole series of alienations that are installed in what seems intuitively to be like, oh, I just like this. This is what I want.
Absolutely. And this is one of the more difficult things. And just to pick up on what you were saying about the founder of Victoria's Secret, I listened to the podcast where they explained, how Victoria's Secret sort of rose to prominence and then saw its decline, and also in relation to Jeffrey Epstein. And it's kind of amazing that you bring that up, because just yesterday I was at the mall and I walked by Victoria's Secret and I thought about that, because they had as their front-facing image for the billboard a full-figured woman in lilac bra and panties, and she's smiling. And I was like, this is dramatically different from the way in which Victoria's Secret operated for so long, because Victoria's Secret is an excellent example of the ways in which the female body is being mobilized specifically for men's viewing pleasure, even as we're acting as if this is actually a store for women. Victoria's Secret was very much about providing the kind of lingerie that men will want to see on their girlfriends. And once we sort of started to move away from the age of romantic couplings, which is where we're at right now, more towards these horrendous situationships that people don't know how to get out of, that's when Victoria's Secret started to see its stock fall. So it's really interesting that now they are genuinely trying to connect with women, whereas they previously were not.
Yeah. I mean, I think I want to kind of just pick up some of what you're saying about the original, and now we're talking about like stories of courtly love, like the troubadours, right? Early on, 12th century, and for a few centuries after that, in France and beyond. The way that you framed it in terms of like, these are stories of love and loss. And this is like, Jacques Lacan is obsessed with courtly love because it's also about lack, right? Like, so it's so interesting. And, you know, I haven't fully worked this out yet. So I'm talking, I mean, as always, you know this, like, just like you're in a classroom, you're talking to a mic, you're always kind of, unless you've rehearsed, you're kind of like, I'm thinking on my feet. So, you know, one of the things I have been kind of mulling since I finished The End of Love. And I will say, well, I mean, full disclosure, Patrick and I are married. So, you know, we have some, like, but I also am like deeply unromantic. Like if you gave me something on Valentine's Day, like we would have words.
Yeah, we don't.
Like, like I would be like, it's like you don't even understand me a little bit, right? But you know, I think the thing, you know, besides my own particular like total lack of sentimentality, the more interesting point is about like at the beginning of romance, there is like, you only desire what you can't have, right? Like these aren't stories that end with happily ever after. This is someone else's wife, right? This is someone else's white high status wife, and you're the guy with the loot in the corner, right? Like it doesn't end up with you together. So that's like the thing of which you're tracking its decline, right? So, and I think there is this sort of, you know, you're talking about conversations with friends, and I'm certainly, I think we're all familiar with the idea of like, you know, the sort of the pressure to embody the couple form, right? Like that is the heteronormative imperative, right? Is to force us all into these narrow paired formations, let's say. But there's not really a nostalgia in your book. Do you know what I mean?
No.
It's like there's no room for it, because it's like I think at once you're saying something like, well, this thing is over, but also it never was.
Yeah, there it is. I love the way you phrased that. It's over and it never was. Romance was at its peak when it was not tied to commitment. And just going back to what you were saying about you and your partner, it's really interesting to hear you articulate that, because I was talking to my cousin, and she's married. And, you know, she was like, you know what? We were together, like her and her husband have been married for about 10 years, but they were a couple for much longer, maybe like 17 years. And she's like, for so much of the time in which we were together, we were broke. We were in college. We didn't have very much money. And yet there was so much pressure for us to follow this romantic pathway.
Yeah.
It was so much pressure for us to get married, and also get married while we had kids, you know, and they had first kid. Why don't you have other kids? There's all of these ways in which romance has inaugurated a script for people's entire lives.
Yeah.
So the first part is just dating until you get it right. You know, you find finally a partner and you get married, and that doesn't work out. Oh, throw them away, find another partner, get married. You are never supposed to be free of being on this pathway, right? And taking all these steps. And you've got the kids and they're in college, great. Now you have to make sure that your kids give you grandkids and do all the exact same, right? So there's so much pressure in our society being placed on people, even people who are heterosexual, to follow this very narrow path. And it just actually kills the romance. And I'm not one of these people who suggest that we need it whatsoever. I mean, the whole idea is that you have a passionate, erotic affair with an individual that is not meant to last. That is what romance is. And maybe that's fun. You know, perhaps that feels good. But the idea that we should all be doing it and that we should never not be doing it. Oh, and has the fire gone out of your marriage? Oh my gosh, it's time to rekindle it with some new lingerie. Like there's such a demand.
Perhaps for Victoria's Secret. Can I interest you?
Yeah. So I mean, like, that is, interestingly enough, the like trying to turn it into something that everyone can do and should do is what killed it. But the other thing that I want to get back to is this whole question of who gets a romance. And I like the fact that you brought up this whole idea of the courtly love. A romance is a courtly love, right? If it's a form of love at all, which I'm skeptical about. But if you think of love as just an intense emotion, which is the primary definition in the West, curiously enough, then okay. But if you think of love through the Buddhist means as a type of loving compassion and kindness towards others and a giving of self, well, then romance doesn't have anything to do with those things, right? So it all depends on what your particular vantage point is. But the idea of romance as a courtly love is to suggest that the people who have access to it are in the courts, right? They are aristocrats. They are nobles. They are not the peasants, the serfs, or the slaves. And not for nothing, there was a man by the name of Andreas Capellanos, who I describe in my book, who wrote a book called The Art of Courtly Love, in which he details that explicitly. It's like, okay, you're middle class, you want a woman who's middle class, put in minimal effort. You're a middle class person, maybe the status of a knight, and you want to get a noble woman? Oh, now you have to try hard, is what you have to do. Oh, wait, you're a knight and you want to have some type of sexual intrigue with a peasant or a slave? Don't worry about it. You just rape them, right? So one of the other things that I tell my students when I teach about this topic is that romance is also furthering rape culture, because it says some people who are high status are worthy of all this effort and energy called a romance, and other people are not. They're worthy of assault.
I think about this fantasy too, that's sometimes present, and even the idea that, like, well, the people in the courts are having this, right? Or like the initial fantasy that somebody else has the thing, right? You may not be a member of the royal court, but at least they're having it, right? So it's possible for someone, and then you're like, well, maybe I can become a knight, or maybe I will be discovered as a long lost prince or something. But there's some sort of like, it's not the idea that somebody could have total fulfillment and total partnership and it just be this eternal perfect thing. And
it makes no sense.
Yeah, and then you get, and the reaction formations, the ways in which like we respond to and metabolize the fact that we're not getting it, become the source of all these other antagonisms. Like, well, wait, no, how do I have to get this from somewhere. So I will reach down the social ladder to briefly indulge myself. Right. Or I will show these women what they're really missing by being an absolutely terrible person to every single one I meet. Right. This kind of like these odd, but they're legible and coherent insofar as that they represent these kind of like broken attempts to reconcile yourself to the fact that you don't have something that actually no one can have.
I really like the way that you put that. When you said it's supposed to be somehow total and exciting and eternal. It's like, wait, nothing is like that ever. So why would we ever allow anyone to suggest to us that we could have something that is perfect forever? Right? Nothing is going to be perfect forever. And ironically enough, the installation of romantic courtship in what might otherwise be normal, natural affiliations between two people actually removes the personal aspect, because now you're not coming to an individual hoping to discover who they are and what they're about. You've got a checklist of things you want to make sure they got. Okay, this is a man. How much money does he have? My brother said he went on a date not too long ago where one of the first questions the woman asked him was what kind of car he drove. And he was like, okay, we won't be staying together very long. So yeah, you're a woman, you're a straight woman. You're supposed to be doing the romance thing. Okay, how much money does this guy have? What kind of job does he have? Does he already have any kids? Where does he live? Does he own his own home? You're a man looking for a woman. Let's see. Is she tall and thin? Is she white or at least not too black looking? Is the hair not too curly? Oh, right. So it makes what's supposed to be the most personal, fulfilling thing in your life, which is a tremendous amount of pressure for any one relationship, completely impersonal. It's not about them at all.
Go back if we can. I mean, not back, but I want to revisit something that you were getting into, Sabrina, about the ways that you talk to your students about how romance is actually not only related to status, class, race, but to rape. In that only some women are deemed worthy of being an object of desire in this sort of way. And I'm hoping that we can spend some time talking about the first chapter of the book, which I think is just phenomenal and is in conversation with so many other really important pieces of writing. And it's where you talk about the notion of Black women as what you call the commons. Can you tell our listeners about both the historical dimensions and contemporary manifestations of this idea of Black women as the commons, and also about its implications for how we might think about race, gender, and love in our current moment?
So when we think about the commons, we think about something that is collectively owned and managed and intended for the benefit of the many. And that's precisely how Black women's bodies were viewed as a result of slavery. We all know that slave owners had free and easy access to Black women's bodies. They were simply their property. They were literally the commons. What we don't often recognize is that Black men too frequently had easy access to Black women's bodies. And so what we have is a romantic culture in which there's a tremendous amount of pressure on men to behave a particular way to get a high status woman. But we also have women who are by design not high status. You have to work too hard to have them. In fact, you can take them at any time that you want them. Now, you can understand just from that beginning how it's almost impossible for Black women to recover a sense of personhood after all of this. And then now we're supposed to be entering a romantic economy in a white supremacy on equal footing with white women. None of this is possible. So this helps us to explain how, if you look at the dating apps, you will find that Black women are rated below the bar by white men, Asian men, Latino men, and even Black men. Men across race have remarkably similar understandings of the kinds of women that they're looking for. Very different from what you see with women. So going back to an earlier point, if you take a look at what women are seeking, frequently women are seeking men of their own race. But that's not the case with, well, Black men especially. So what we are dealing with as Black women is the demand that we find a romantic partner and get married and do all the other things that are required of women in our society, whereas that's never really been an option for us, not for very many years. The main period in which we see Black women, A, being allowed to get married, and then B, successfully doing it, is the time period shortly after slavery, in which people were excited about this newfangled thing called marriage they could finally get up to, right up until Loving v. Virginia, when interracial relationships are now legalized. So there was a short window in which Black women were considered strongly viable partners. And now, in many respects, when men are on the apps looking for women, they don't look for Black women unless they're looking for an opportunity to have sex with someone and then walk away.
I found the notion of the commons as you work with it so also generative in so many different directions. One, and two of which I think were particularly salient, just as I process stuff, in the news at the moment, right? I was looking at the perennial, all these debates about sort of like right wing, the what possibly could someone who does not look like JD Vance see in JD Vance, right? Or why does like Trump, like what's up with the Trump polling figures among some sections of like Latinx and Black men? I think was some of the stuff I was reading this morning, right? And those are all incredibly complicated, and I don't want to decompose it into too much. But like one thing that the idea of having a certain set of the population, i.e., Black women, sort of on this bottom of a hierarchy of abjection is that, well, there's a through line of misogyny. It's a misogynoir, like that is a kind of pact here. And that's one angle on which, I don't know, like a hypothetical right-leaning Black voter might vibe with Donald Trump insofar as that he just has a problem with Kamala Harris or something, right? And it's crude, right? But like there are men in the manosphere, right, who come from a variety of positions who are surprisingly, or might seem surprisingly, willing to jettison a lot of other identity and material-based solidarities and antagonisms for whatever the brief sort of moment of grounding that's like, oh, well, we can agree at least that these people are objects, right? That there's some sort of like, it's almost like I don't want to use the word of like a pact or some sort of implicit gesture, but somehow it seems to be a way to consolidate something. And I guess this brings me to the second thing that I was thinking about in terms of sort of the notion of the commons at work and thinking about the commons and like processes of like capitalist enclosure, right? And how these narratives of some of the thought exercises that characterize a lot of Western thinking on this subject kind of mystify.
This is straight up out of John Locke. Right? Yeah, for sure.
Kind of mystify the actual conditions of human inequality that go into the creation of like these market spaces. And to the point that, we're not all like some people in the social contract are literally objects of financial transactions, and they're covered by the social contract in the sense that they're like property, but not as contracting subjects. And where this got me thinking in terms of the common stuff too was if we Grant, I think it's a correct thing to do, both and provocative heuristically, in addition to being accurate, that Black women occupy this sort of position as sort of commons. Then some of the future ideological movements that you track, i.e. with like the gold digger analysis, right? Where gold digger is something initially that's kind of applied kind of grudgingly, but it has a little bit of a frisson when it's to women who are like Ziegfeld dancers or something, right? That's to white women. It's like, well, they're entrepreneurs. Somehow when it becomes applied to Black women, it's like, no, they're purely parasitic. And this way, and what this, to tie a bow on this, it's like, well, it's okay when I'm not agreeing with the stereotype, I'm just playing it out, right? If there is something bad but sort of attractive about the white woman who is supposedly only into relationships because of social climbing, right? That's at least okay because she herself exists in a different relationship to property, right? She's not the commons. Whereas the Black woman who is, again, freighted with that same set of expectations and stereotypes has the super added aspect of coming from a position in which they don't even have the right to like access to property or to mobility in the same logics.
Yeah. It's like, white women are treated as sort of like meritorious, and then Black women are treated as meretricious. It's like, on the one hand, there's the idea that, well, these are the people who are deserving of love. And I love this idea of, Marilyn Monroe and the other women playing the role of the gold digger as sort of being entrepreneurs. It's like, no, we know what our assets are. And also we live in a society that doesn't allow women to work. Talking about the foundation of gold diggerism, which was in the early 20th century, it was unusual for women to have access to employment, much less the kind of employment that would allow them to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. So what were they going to do? They were going to be able to use their looks to get what they want from men, because not for nothing, that's sort of what the romantic ideal is encouraging.
Right.
It's saying, okay, you need to look a particular way. And if you do, then you will get what you want, which is the love of a man. And so these women are like, okay, well, we'll just cut out the love part and we'll just get the man to give us stuff, right? So, I mean, there is this way in which it's hilarious, and it probably wouldn't have grown into the phenomenon that it became were it not for the fact of sexism eliminating the possibility that women could work and pay their own way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but when you turn from sort of the look of sort of white women who merit this type of behavior on the part of men giving them things, to women who supposedly are unworthy of it, which is overwhelmingly Black women as it's described in the popular media, then it's like, oh, wait. No. They're not deserving of any gifts. Oh, what are they trying to do? Oh my gosh, are they trying to climb out of their station? No. They are simply trying to take advantage of us. So there's a way in which very similar activities go from being like sort of funny and lighthearted to a threat to society once race and especially Blackness becomes a factor. Because again, the whole idea of having a white supremacy is not for nothing. People are always like, okay, we're eventually going to live in a multicultural paradise. It's like, and what would be the mechanism for that? I've never heard of anyone being willing to give up their privileges. And so unless we're going to engage in another revolution, which is absolutely necessary, we're not just going to fall into a multicultural paradise. And in the meantime, people are going to remain suspicious of women who are not sufficiently white.
I was just thinking too that, and just another thing I wanted to commend to listeners to read, like, I had no idea about the details of the Linda Taylor welfare queen sort of story. That had.
Oh yeah.
That could I ask you just to speak to that for 1 second? Because that was such a, as a stereotype, as a trope, it looms so large, both in discourse in the 80s and 90s, but to this present day. And, I think our friend Adam Kotsko, who does political theology stuff, has been like, this is almost literally like a demonic figure conjured by the discourse to like batter people down in terms of either asking for any basic social benefits, but also to make them sort of hate one another for receiving, someone's getting away with something, right? That's like, I guess maybe that's kind of like the flip side here of like the dark, like, oh, at least the people in Camelot are having, like romance and sex. Now it's like someone out there is filling up their shopping cart with steaks with my taxpayer money, right? It's like someone else is getting away with something that I can't have, and now we don't have the kings and queens for it. We just want to blame the people who are immediately proximate. But neither here nor there. Could you tell us about the Linda Taylor story? Because it blew my mind.
Yeah, and so I just want to first invoke Ange Marie Hancock, who wrote the book Politics of Disgust, in which she talks about the tremendous cultural power of the welfare queen, because many of us have heard of this idea. And we think of it as a stereotype. Oh, okay, well, they assume that all Black women are on welfare or whatever. But there's actually, like many things, there's a story. Like, there was a beginning to this. And there was a real life woman by the name of Linda Taylor. And before we get into the things that Linda Taylor actually got up to, I think it's important to remind people that, sure, she was a con artist, but it's not just what she was doing, but the political utility of what she was doing. So we were living in the early 1980s, and really a lot of this discourse began in the late 1970s, in a backlash to racial integration, in a backlash to the civil rights movement. Because even though people today like to be like, oh, MLK, in reality, the civil rights movement at the time in which it was taking place was never popular. Yes, it was influential, but popular it was not. It only was later co-opted by the left, and then eventually, as we know, the right, as a way of acting like we've really come so far as a society. Whereas instead, racism, sexism, and many of the other isms are just now more subtle, more hidden, and more difficult to uncover. So Linda Taylor was a con artist. She was a biracial woman, a light-skinned Black woman whose mother was white, who decided, I suppose, because of the fact that she was ejected from polite white society, owing to the fact that she was half Black, that she would run a series of cons on men. And this would be the way that she would get by. So usually she would enter a romantic relationship with a white man and get a bunch of benefits from this man. And then she would divorce him. Just assuming that they would get married. Sometimes they wouldn't get married. At least once she got married to a white man. They had a child. The child was too dark-skinned to be obviously white. And then the man divorced her. She did this with Black men as well. So there was a way in which she was running a very obvious kind of, con, in which she was getting hooked up with men, taking money from them or trying to, and then sometimes she was having children and using the children to get onto welfare. So this is how her story, because it was so dramatic and she had conned so many different people over time through romance and childbearing, how she became a lightning rod on the right. So Reagan decided to use the specter of the image of someone like Linda Taylor to create this phantom, this monster that was sort of like haunting our relationships, this welfare queen, which is really like a malevolent ghost. Like, you have to be careful of the Black women who are going to try to get into relationships just to get things from men. And then when they don't work out, have babies just to get on welfare, right? Now, one of the really serious problems with the welfare queen, as it pertains to questions of romance and not just the politics of racism in America, is the way in which the ideas about the welfare queen were folded into the understanding of the gold digger when the gold digger became a Black woman. So we can even hear this in Kanye West's song Gold Digger, which, yes, by the way, is his highest grossing song ever. Like, think about his supposedly illustrious career, right? And this song that he has disavowed is by far his highest grossing song. So in that song, we have, this image of this woman who he's in a relationship with, or actually he's telling a story about some other man that he's heard about, right? So this other man's in a relationship with this woman and has this baby. And then suddenly he's paying all this money for this woman and this baby. And then he realized the baby isn't his, right? The final twist of the knife. So the issue with, this welfare queen is it actually crosses many different terrains. And one of the major problems that I find with it is that there are so many Black male entertainers who have been willing to call on, even if implicitly, this welfare queen discourse to shame and stigmatize Black women. And that's actually being used by some of them as yet another reason why they don't want to date Black women. Okay. I date white women because white women give me things. This was literally like a very prominent TikTok / Instagram by a guy who was trying to explain why so many athletes, collegiate athletes who are Black men, date white women.
I mean, it strikes me also that the notion of Black women as the commons is another return to this theme of homosociality masquerading as heterosexuality in your book, right? Because there is it involves a certain bargain between white men and Black men.
I love that you brought that up because there is a long history of white men and Black men being in cahoots in the domination of Black women and the pursuit of white women going back to slavery. And I want to have compassion for Black men because, of course, what happened is that, we were bought or stolen from the continent of Africa, brought to a variety of different countries, including the United States, and then told to behave in ways that, mirror white people because we're trying to prove that we're civilized, which is, to me, quite obvious evidence that civilization is barbaric. Mm-hmm. But we can understand how, they, okay, well, our ancestry, our lineage, we've completely decoupled from that. And all that we have are white men as our guides for masculinity.
It's hard to talk about it, I find, in a way that doesn't sound flattening, but I feel like there's something at core or something really sort of deep waters happening in terms of the way that this country in particular, we're coming from the US, though people are listening to this from elsewhere. So forgive us, those of, people who are interested in putting the US on the couch or, from abroad. Thank you for rolling
your
with
forbearance.
us. Yeah. But I dislike the language of like original sin and all that in its theological sort of ways, right? I much more prefer the idea of I would rather, I think a better way to talk about it in terms of like traumas and repetitions and sequelae and reconfigurations of them and such. Like some things are happen, we disavow them, but then they come back in some ways, or precisely because we don't look at them, they come back in other ways. Like these are logics that make a lot of sense to me. But I found myself thinking, particularly in your chapter on the gold digger, how there is this, the vilification of the Black woman as parasite, right? And as also as existing in a kind of like a zero sum like transaction that's doing something to the sacred family unit, white or Black, or like the idea of the family. They're existent, that they're like, again, I think the zero sum thing is interesting too. And I wonder if there's some like neoliberal, like competitive type thing here, right? Like the commons is shrinking as a marketplace and now we're all going to fight over it. Like there's something going on there. But as I think about this, it's this idea of like the antagonisms that sort of flourish in these moments and the way they express things that are not acknowledged, or that we kind of want to, the people that are turning to these tropes kind of understand but have to push away in this kind of symptomatic way. And I think incest in the family and the way that that's sort of like a major feature of the American like pornographic imaginary, apparently. But the
that was learning those keyword search terms, and that was an education.
But you have the note here about it's just a couple lines in the chapter about how there was the figure of like the Black nursemaid in a family who had literally quite possibly been caring for young white kids, but like literally at the interface of bodies and the exchange of like basic touch and care and milk and all these things are happening. And again, in this way that it's legible, in the way that horrifying symptomatic things are kind of legible, it makes a sort of sense that rather than think about that type of interdependence or that like the presence of people like that within the white family as part of the family or as, exploited members of social reproduction, right? Instead of it being, well, these are the people who nursed me, right? Instead, it's I'm on the lookout for these people who are going to destroy my family when I haven't. Right. There's some sort of working through and displacement of
and disavowal.
Yeah.
The nuclear family, the idealized nuclear family in which the woman stays at home, which so obviously is a relatively recent innovation, only in the past couple of 100 years. It relies on there being other women working in the home who do not have the ability to do that. And so this is one of the more troubling things about the consecration of the nuclear family around the romantic ideal, which is that it sanctifies this couple because they're in love and their love is so passionate. And now they're creating this little sentimental nuclear family. And they're, as you are saying, disavowing the reality that the labor that needs to be done in the home is being done by someone else. If it's not being done by the wife, which of course, the higher up you go in the status hierarchy, it's not being done by the wife, then it is being done by a day laborer or a live-in laborer. It is being done by a domestic servant, or sometimes, obviously, historically, a slave who is a woman, overwhelmingly. And so this means that the legitimate couple relies inherently on there being illegitimate women who are not capable of being part of this legitimate couple. Now, again, I'm going to invoke Stephanie Coontz because this book was actually very important.
Yeah.
What she describes is that when romance became attached to the marriage, not only the nuclear family become more important, right? Because nuclear families had been existing in England at least since the 13th century, but the nuclear family became more important. It became more insular. And now other social and family relations were treated as less important. So that's one of the things. But the other really important thing that it did is that it gave men in particular an out. If they had sex with a woman, they got pregnant because they're like, oh, yeah, sure, I got her pregnant, but I don't love her. Oh, well, then she can't be expected to marry her then. So suddenly, when romance was attached to marriage, there were now scores of women who would have otherwise been able to rely on family ties to force a man who impregnated her to marry her. I mean, I'm sure we don't want to go back to that. But the immediate consequence was that now these women did not have marriages and they may not have had any place to go. There was an explosion of homelessness and prostitution amongst poor women because of romance being tied to marriage.
So, speaking of men behaving badly, I want to take a turn to an aspect of this book that I feel like we would be really remiss if we didn't talk about, which is the theory of the fuckboy, which I was not expecting to find in here, but
it was amazing, just amazing.
And sidebar, we might have to talk about F-Boy Island a little bit, and also about Patrick's favorite sort of niche reality show, which we have to get to at some point, which is called Tool Academy. We'll get there. Okay, so something to look forward to. But the fuckboy is like a specter that haunts this book, along with some of these other not just tropes, but like figures that we see in the player, the pimp. And there's this incredibly chilling section towards the end of the book where you talk about this, I'm going to kind of say species in some ways of fuckboy that you call cis-handed men. And we talk on this podcast so much, we talk about psychoanalysis. And so we're talking about fantasy. We're often talking about fantasy, and that's something that it can be joyful, it can be meaningful, it can expand our worlds, it can be adaptive. But it can also be, as this book points out in myriad ways, a means of avoiding genuine human interaction. So can you tell us about your theory of the fuckboy? And particularly, can we talk about some of the ways in which the fuckboy and what you're calling the cis-handed version of the fuckboy is in some way about avoiding real human interaction in favor of fantasies that have been specifically designed by other men and generally by wealthy white men who stand to profit from their desires?
So there's a lot of confusion about exactly what a fuckboy is.
Yes.
So I decided to start reading online pieces about the way people were describing fuckboys. And let me just tell you that white women feminists who were writing about fuckboys were doing such an incredible job. I was like, you know what? Let's give them their props because they were detailing, very specifically what kinds of things these men are doing. And so from that, I was able to glean like a working definition, which is that a fuckboy is an emotionally manipulative and withholding man. And he's doing this to have power over women and also to try and get as close as possible to the kind of woman that would be considered appropriate according to pornography, which is also the same kind of woman considered appropriate according to romance. We've already articulated the various qualities. So that is what a fuckboy is. People often think a fuckboy is a player, but fuckboys and players, while they share a DNA in that they are manipulative and exploitative, actually operate in different ways. Players are usually trying to explain to women how much they mean to them. Oh my gosh, you're my only girlfriend. The other woman, I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't know who she is, right? So there's always some type of attempt to push away the reality that they are indeed having multiple relationships at the same time, not at all ethical non-monogamy, and telling each one how much they love them, right? So that is a player. So with a fuckboy, the idea is I'm not going to tell you how I feel about you, but I will constantly divulge what my feelings are in my body so that you are always worried about how I feel, right? There's a fantastic video that you can find on YouTube in which you have Iyanla Vanzant, right, who's like one of these gurus, I think Oprah approved, who's in a room with like a group of Black men and a group of Black women. And the Black women are wearing degrading messages on their chests that say things like bitter and angry, right? And the men are lecturing them on how hard it is to be a Black man and how Black women don't know how to understand how to show up for them. Now, of course, it is so mind-blowing because there are exactly zero movements for racial justice in America that do not have, if they are about Black people that aren't majority Black women. It doesn't matter if it's Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. The majority of people who show up are Black women. Black women show up. So just the very idea that Black women don't care about Black men is just so preposterous. But it's another way in which Iyanla, in this instance, and this group of Black men are trying to teach Black women how to be proper women. Oh, no. You're supposed to be concerned about my feelings. Okay, that's the role of the woman. You're docile, you're polite, you're nurturing. You're concerned about me, right? And the men who articulate it that way or behave in that way, those are the fuckboys. Now, I describe another set of men that I call the cishanded fuckboys, the subset. And I wanted to have a term to acknowledge their gender, that they are cisgender, and sexuality, that they are not heterosexual. Heterosexual implies an interest in women and also having most of your sex with women if you are a cisgender man. That's not what's going on here. These men are mostly consuming pornography that turns women into a series of holes that they might decide to ejaculate into. And they are masturbating into it. And they are then turning to real life women in many instances to act out these pornographic fantasies. So these fantasies are extremely harmful because if we think about the way romance turned all women into a trope, all women who are eligible for romance into a trope, you have to be this list of qualities. Then pornography is like, okay, well, not only are women a list of qualities, but they're also just like a list of body parts. And, we can do whatever we want with these body parts. These are just whatever, just stuff. So when I talk about these cis-handed fuckboys, I'm talking about these kinds of men who are all about themselves and their feelings, and then want women to be concerned about their feelings, who are also harassing, horrifying, and assaulting women using pornography.
Your book is full of delightful sort of puns and double entendres that you own, and I think the cis-handed one is just one of my favorite. There's also like this kind of, and now I'm realizing this is very homosocially a double triple entendre, but there's something about like the secondhand character, or like the second-handed character of the fantasies here, right? Like that this is what Les Wexner, right, wants you to want, right? Or this is what Larry Flint wants you to want. And it's, I know in the beginning we were talking about people being like the comedian being like, well, like, what do I like? I like hot ladies with tits, right? I mean, like real generic type stuff, right? And maybe some people are authentically that way, and God bless them. If that's their truth, that's their truth. But also, there is this kind of like aspect of like, and I think some of the, I think like Brett Carr and some of these psychoanalysts who've written about fantasy will talk about where it's like a thing that can happen is a failure or like an inability to exercise the capacity to fantasize, which is about so much more than just sexual fantasies or at least fantasies in which there is like literally, interaction on the level of like people like holes and parts and plumbing, etc. Right. And I think that idea then that if your encounter with your own sexuality, but also the capacity of sexual encounters with others is so thoroughly mediated in this through pornography, there comes a point where there actually is no actual encounter with the other. And that loss doesn't just affect the person in the future failed potentials of encounters and all these other sort of sequelae from violence to like loneliness, etc. But there's also a corresponding failure or a missed opportunity for the person themselves. Like, well, what do I actually want? Right? Or like, what might I be able in encountering this other person to realize that I want from them, but I would never want from anybody else. And, there's a whole avenues of self-discovery and also vulnerability that are foreclosed from the get-go in favor of these encounters that on the one hand, if I have all this sort of upfront intimacy, this is the fuckboy being like, well, here's 10 different reasons why I feel real bad today and why I'm not going to let you get a word in edgewise, to the like, let's immediately get to like these very particular hardcore things that I've been, thinking about for years. Everything else falls out there somehow, or at least something.
There's a certain generic quality, right? And this is something that I think you can see if you watch all these reality TV shows that involve, fuckboys and the women who love them.
Oh,
or at least the women who sleep with them. But I want to, and I think this is related. I want to read a line from your book that I will say that I burst out laughing reading in. I read out loud we had one copy and I read it first. I burst out laughing and I read it to Patrick, and then my mother was visiting and I read it to her too.
Oh, Mom, I'm glad. Okay,
which is, and this is in the chapter Enter the Fuckboys. So now I'm quoting Sabrina here. In a move that Michel Foucault would certainly tip a hat to, these men were constantly in the process of divulging their emotional state to women as a means of explaining their emotional unavailability. I mean, okay, first of all, that's an incredible line. I died laughing. I wanted just to read it because I wanted other people to hear it. But more beyond my just wanting to read that out loud, I think there's something here that's very interesting in connection with what Patrick is talking about like the kind of foreclosure of individual fantasy and desire, and maybe the inability to see others. I mean, I'm less interested in the language of individuality than to say like in their singularity. Like there's something like here about not only seeing potential sexual partners as basically fungible, right? Basically interchangeable, actually in the same way that employers often see employees, right? One of them, you fire one, you get another. One dies, guess what? You hire another, right? There's like an incredible impersonality and genericness. But what's distinctive here, I think, about your analysis and is so also aligned with things that we think about on this podcast all the time is the weaponization of therapy speak. Is this sort of like, I have the language to tell you how I can't be there for you. Do you know what
yes.
I have the language about my feelings to make it clear that I don't have them for you, but also they're your responsibility. Like double binds on double binds.
Yeah. So I have a couple of responses to that. And I think, the second one, some people aren't going to like. But the first one is that this guy, I believe his name is Mark Manson, he wrote this book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which I did, read and enjoy. But he had a follow-up book, and I'm forgetting the title of it, but this book was about relationship. I think it was something like Love is Not Enough. And
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're familiar with this.
I read a review. I haven't read it.
You read a review of that? Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, then, yeah. So I was listening to this book and I thought there was something that was deeply off about it, because part of what's happening here is that it's overwhelmingly women, or at least in the audiobook version, there are these women who are trying to figure out, hey, why is it that I'm spending all this time with this man, but it's not going anywhere? Effectively, these women are trapped in situationships. And, he's trying to explain, you need to talk to him, get him to come out of his shell, like try to figure out what's going on there. And I thought that is such a tremendous amount of labor that is being required of women that no one has ever asked a man to do. I don't know that anyone has said to a man, you know what, talk to a woman, figure out what her feelings are, try to get her to come out of her shell. I've never even heard of that one time. Right. And so she does that, and she gets a resolution. And then after being in a situationship for however many months, they enter a relationship, and who knows where that goes. But it is dependent on the woman caring more about his feelings than he clearly cares about hers. Right. Which is like classic fuckboy behavior. So that's the first response. Now, here's the second response that people aren't going to like. There's a way in which this is, in fact, an outgrowth of feminism. Because feminism, in the middle of the 20th century, there were a lot of women who were like, we want men to be more in touch with their feelings. And they were like, got it. This is what I'm feeling. And so I want you to be more concerned. So there is a way in which this idea from feminists, like in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, is being weaponized and is being used by men to say, my feelings do matter. So you care about them. I don't care about what you're going through. is a mess.
Patrick, can I ask you? You look like you're gathering your thoughts, but I desperately want you, while we're talking about the fuckboy, to talk about you've been probably waiting for this the entire time that we've had this podcast, and we've never gotten to talk about it, which is this niche reality show called
Tool Academy.
Tool Academy, which at some point before we were married, you were like, no, you have to watch this. And I was like, what? Like, I don't really watch reality TV. This doesn't seem important. And yet I was mesmerized by it. And I feel like it really speaks to the fuckboy as, and particularly in this dimension of like the ability to masquerade as being deeply like in touch with some sort of like interiority without ever actually having that interiority.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, okay.
Do you mind a small digression? I feel like it might give you more fodder for, your thesis.
I don't want to I'll nerd out about this too much, but like, it's a reality TV show that was on VH1, I think from 2009 to maybe 2010. Right. And I think the producers of it, one of them, Sally Ann Salsano, I think, people who were also involved in producing the Jersey Shore. Right. And so that'll give you some sense of like the demographic of the people that are on it. Like they're essentially, I think they were all out of some part like Venice or somewhere else in the LA scene. And it was lots of alternately fully tanned, fake tanned bodybuilder / professional party promoter / dancers / actors. But like they were all these young men who were, they were waiting to be discovered.
They were fuckboys avant la lettre.
Yeah. And the premise of the show was, well, and you can see why they only got a couple, like 2 or 3 series out of this, because it hinges on a twist, right? But that all these dudes were selected to participate in a reality TV show, which they thought was going to be a series of competitions as to the person who would become the face for a new like brand of some kind. I think in the first season, it was like an energy drink or something, right? It was like party fuel, like all night long, whatever, right? And so they are all these guys show up.
Like Mr. something.
Yeah, you're like Mr. Party or like Mr. Can't Stop or something like, right? And
it seems so lame. I mean, like the premise that you could be Mr. Party and like, is that going to take off on social media? I'm sure that's what they're hoping for.
Well, and so this is the thing, right? Yeah, it felt like it was generic in this way. And I don't know if people were that naive in 2009, but like it was like, I did a little research, like it was all these people who were basically partying in the same clubs and stuff in LA.
Yeah.
And they're all waiting for the call, right? They're all wait. Of course, none of them. It soon emerges that a lot of them are just like literally like they sleep all day, and they're living with their their girlfriend and her 2 kids from another relationship, and they're don't worry, baby, the call's going to come anytime. Like what? But they sign up for it.
She's picking up the tab. Yeah,
so familiar.
They get to this like mansion, and they're encouraged to develop their own. They all have to have their own name, like their own, like Mr. Awesome, Mr. Incredible. I remember there was a dude who was Hapa, and actually I quite like this one dude. His name was Matsu Flex. He was really cool, and they all have their own. They all have their own moves, and they all have their own catchphrases and stuff. And they're in the pilot of the episode of the series, you're like they're getting ready to be the competitors, to be like the official party king of like spring break 2010 or whatever, right? And so they walk catwalks, they have young
dancing up on all these women.
Yeah, women are throwing like tops at them, and you actually get some backstage footage of like their makeup artists like being like, so are you dating anybody? And the guys are like, nah, not really. Like, oh, it's not serious. Or like, she knows it's ending. Like getting the numbers from women, etc., making plans to see them in the room, etc. And then they finally all arrive at the first day of the thing, and there's a host who begins to tell them about how all these exciting, really cool, like they're going to have like beer pong, like Mogadishu tournaments or whatever. Like it's going to be like the one, right, is going to be emerged. And then suddenly the lights go out as though there's a power shortage. And the lights come back on, and there's a different host. And the host is like, well, you thought you were here to compete for the crown of Party King. Actually, you're on a different show called Tool Academy. You have all been nominated by your girlfriends, fiancés, or significant others who think that you're a tool.
Wow.
And are going to leave you if you don't pass a series of like finishing school, charm school exercises with them. And by the way, and then a two-way mirror reveals, they've been watching this whole time.
Wow.
We're going to show them the videos of you backstage, like saying that they're not seeing anybody, etc.
You guys think you're competing for Mr. Awesome, but your girlfriends are sending you to
the Tool Academy.
It's time to find out if you can take a bro and make him a man.
I'm here to prove myself. I'll do whatever it takes.
The Tool Academy premieres Sunday, January 11th at 10.
And then the rest of the show is like literally episodes where they have to like build IKEA furniture together and do like potato bag races and stuff.
Do couples therapy.
Yeah, do couples therapy.
But by ambush.
Yes.
All by ambush. And then at the end of every episode, someone gets a date because the men and the women are segregated, right? So that you get to go with your girlfriend or would-be ex-girlfriend or whatever. And then someone has to meet their former partner or soon-to-be former partner outside, and she's got a limousine, and she either takes him in the limousine or basically says, like, get the fuck out of here. You're just a tool.
Oh, that's the like, whatever. The host is like, I'm sorry. You're just a tool.
You're just a tool. But
I mean,
it's
the show seems
incredible.
a slightly violent, but I have to admit, it sounds fascinating. I do want to see it because, rarely do you see people getting their comeuppance. And it sounds like that's what they're trying to give them.
It is.
So something about that could be satisfying.
I really want to recommend it because but also because it gets it like this, like it's the Fuckboy in this kind of way, right? These like because they have to account for like, well, no, actually, no, I'm not going to those improv classes, or I spent the money instead of buying the turntables, I actually just got waxed, like this type of stuff, right? That they have to come clean about. But there are these moments, particularly when the men are interacting with one another, and then also the men have to watch the videos of themselves doing like their flexes and their catchphrases and talking about women sitting next to the women that they're actually in relationships with.
This is
and
painful.
You see that they start like the wild thing about it is that for some of them are straight up psychopaths. Like some of them are like, one dude's like, yeah, I'm gonna learn my girl good. I train her. And like you're like, okay, this person just a straight up like run. But others of these people, you see them kind of collapse because like there's something about the identity that they're performing is so thoroughly about this mediation. It's so like performative and false that when you get into this like hall of mirrors type thing where they know they're on TV competing to not be a tool, that they start having these kind of like profoundly vulnerable kind of like breakdown kind of moments. Yeah. Anyways, where I kind of, to make this, apart from just telling you something that's kind of interesting, two things to tell you that I think very directly germane. A lot of them wind up, a lot of these relationships generally don't succeed. I don't think any of them did.
No, I mean,
spoiler.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's like, whoa.
A bunch of the male contestants, though, have since gone on to do gay porn together. So they found one another through this. But then
this is really intriguing now.
Yeah, the second thing was...
It's got layers on layers.
Was my thinking about it just in terms of like, like the neoliberal landscape of like reality TV and also of like hustling for affection and like having to like try out like, because obviously like being a bodybuilder who wants to be the next David Hasselhoff in the year 2010, that's like a whole other level of thing. But like the idea of having to perform certain types of selves in order to receive a basic care or some type of encounter, which you don't even know how to get when you have it, or if you were to have it, you wouldn't know what to deal with it. The reason why it made me think of your work too is just this idea that there are all these different types of mediation that are stacked up on like how we should behave and how we should relate, all these sort of templates that they on the one hand, they promise themselves like, here's the solution. Here's actually how you can connect with someone. Here's how you can be your authentic self. Here's how you can pair. Here's how you can mate, etc. When in reality, they just make the more existential problems like you'll never be happy always, right? Or like we die alone, or love is fleeting. All these other problems, right? They just make those things worse. Like rather than being solutions, they produce additional antagonisms that just proliferate and take new forms and grow and extend themselves over time.
This sounds fascinating. Okay, the show is called
Tool Academy.
Tool Academy.
Tool Academy. Okay, unmake my tool. Tool Academy. Okay, I'm gonna write that down and make sure I take a look at that. I've never even heard of this show, so I can tell you that I have not seen Fuckboy Island because I live Fuckboy Island. So I was like, well, I don't want to see the reruns. But this I can look at, and like kind of like to your point, as you were explaining the show, I thought the premise of the show makes me think the show belongs in the 1980s. Like catchphrases, who are they? Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, like that was big at the time of Terminator, but then already by like the fourth Terminator, they were critical of what they were doing in the first two Terminators. So just the very idea that they would be rolling out, technology from the 1980s in the 2010s or whatever it was, 2009 is already strange. But the other thing that I think is weird about the show is like, they're trying to take men who are effectively gold diggers, right? These men are men who are living with their partners and benefiting from that while also trying to disavow any type of love, right? They're trying to turn gold diggers into Lancelots. I'm like, that's a failed experiment, okay? You're not going to get this man to suddenly become valorous and courageous and brave. For this woman, he's been dehumanizing because why would he do that?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. He's been getting it easily this whole time.
Yeah.
He's not now going to work for it. So this is a really curious premise, and I'm looking forward to checking this out.
It's like the only incentive is, and this makes me think again about these dynamics like the commons and marketplace competition, right? The only way we seem to think to incentivize someone to become the Lancelot here is, well, there's prize money, you're not going to get humiliated on TV, and you have to perform because now everybody is watching, right? It's like you wanted this attention, now you're going to get it good and hard. And that's the only way we can think about making someone change.
And, and the other thing that the show makes me think about are the Black women I know who are supporting Black men who are rappers. And, there's people are going to feel some kind of way about this, but that's fine. I remember when I was a postdoc that I had a fellow postdoc. Obviously, I'm not going to tell anything more about this person than that. She was a super dope, cool Black woman. And she was divorced to a man who was a rapper, and who was still living in her home because he didn't have anywhere else to go. And she was also taking care of his mother. And I thought, so on a postdoc salary, you're supporting yourself, your two kids with this man, his mother and him, and you're not even married. She's like, well, I can't very well have, the father of my children with no place to live. But the thing was that for so many years, she loved him. And she knew he wanted to be a rapper and she was supporting him. So he was going to all of these different events, acting like this was going to be an opportunity to give somebody his mixtape. But at the end of the day, she realized he was just partying it up on her dime. And that's why they got a divorce. But unfortunately, she wasn't then free of the burden of supporting him.
It's like some things, I think, I don't want to be too philosophical about this, right? But it's like, it feels like there's this kind of tragedy. And I don't want to, again, be too broad about this, where it's like, some things actually aren't zero sum, or at least like some things are hard and zero sum in the sense that friend now has yay many thousands of dollars less, but also that like so many of these given scripts or narratives or the ideology of romance, which is so much more than an ideology, as your book indicates, they operate by mobilizing anxieties about like, I'm gonna not be loved, or I have to make myself lovable, or I have to embody some sort of 1980s era or troubadours, some sort of previous model that's given to me of what being desirable and desiring should be. And so much effort is expended on that, and so much competition and interpersonal violence in many different senses happens there, when it just doesn't actually have to be that way. And there could be other possible ways of collaboration and flourishing that like aren't zero sum.
This book it's called The End of Love, but it's not against love, right? It's against romance. Then there's this line in the end, you say, we do not need romance to thrive. So there's a rejection of the romantic ideal. There is a rejection of romance more broadly and of heteronormativity and the values that attend heteronormativity, but it's not a rejection of love. And there's this refrain, and it's literally throughout the book. It begins in the dedication, and it is, absolutely, woven throughout the coda. You are love. Can you tell us a little bit about the vision of love that orients you even as you are rejecting this idea of romance and the romantic ideal. Because it's more of a hopeful book in some ways that I think like there's a dimension to that is like, it ends with you opening onto that, but there is that opening. And I want to make sure, we get a chance to like dwell in that space.
Yeah. And it's funny because when we were sort of like trying to come up with the title, I was sort of working with my editors, and one of them was like, what about death of romance? I feel like you can't have death be the first word of a book. It's like not how that works. So we settled on the end of love. And after we settled on that, we found this line in the book by Candace Bushnell, Sex and the City. Mm-hmm. We are witnessing nothing short of the end of love in Manhattan. Yeah. I mean, and of course, that book was written in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so there, she was letting us know about fuckboyism that was going on amongst boomers. Okay. In case you're wondering, fuckboyism did not start with millennials. At the very least, it was visible with boomers.
I think you get a case for Mr. Big as one of the fuckboys in the book.
Oh, yeah. They definitely, right? Top shelf. So, like, if we're thinking about the fact that we all have the innate capacity to love one another, then we don't have to be concerned about whether or not we look appropriately according to, historical white male ideologies. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that when I say that you are love, that we are all love, what I'm saying is that we all have the capacity for connection, for kindness, for consideration, and for generosity. When we look at historical definitions of the word love that do not come from the West, that's very commonly the way love is presented. It's about selflessness. It's about giving without the expectation of return. Romance, it's about trying to get what you want from an appropriate person. It doesn't even matter your gender. Well, let me rephrase that. It does matter your gender because you need to either be a cisgender man or cisgender woman. There's no role for genderqueer people within a romance. There's no role for trans people within a romance. So as a person who is queer, who has been on some of these queer apps in the past, I remember coming across profiles of trans people that would say things like, are trans people worthy of love? Like, will we get love? And it was really upsetting and sad. But once you understand where romance comes from, you can understand what they're talking about, because romance is very much about heteronormativity or homonormativity. It's not about, sexual or gender nonconformity. So if we want to honor the fact that we all have the capacity to love, we should move away from these standards that tell us that if a person is Black or trans or fat or short or any of the other qualities that are deemed not desirable according to historical white guys, that these people will not have the opportunity to be loved.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. This was like such a fun and generative conversation. And before we go, are you on book tour? Are there dates where people might see you speak, events, anything like that?
Yes. So I'm going to be posting about this on social media,
okay.
Especially on my Instagram, which is @YoginiBlack, mm-hmm. which, by the way, everybody's like, you got to change that because nobody knows it's you. I'm like, everybody's making me put my name. So eventually it would be changed to some version of my name or something like that. But for now, it's @YoginiBlack. Mm-hmm. And so I have a lot of podcast and radio segments lined up, and I am going to have more in-person events at various locations throughout the United States upcoming.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It was really a pleasure. And we will put, so many things. Yeah. The links to the book and all of those things in the notes. So thank you so much for joining us.
Truly.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported by our Patreon community. So if you would like to support the podcast and get 2 additional episodes per month, come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Sabrina Strings and Patrick Blanchfield. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.